Here in this section, we're going to talk about the process of speciation, or how a new species is made. Things like natural selection, genetic drift, change the percentages or frequencies of alleles in a population. But the question is, how does a new species develop? Isolating mechanisms are things that can lead to the formation of new species. So when a population becomes reproductively isolated, meaning cannot reproduce with each other, they can evolve into two separate species. So here we have an ancestral population of salamanders in California. Some groups move to the east, other groups move to the west. Over generations and generations, we get adaptations and natural selection, and we change into two different populations that can no longer mate, and we get two different species. We can come in different ways. We can have what's called behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. Speciation is the formation of new species. Remember, we've talked before about what a species is. It's a population whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That's the key there. It has to be able to produce fertile offspring. The first isolating mechanism we're going to talk about is reproductive isolation. So a population splits into two groups, and the two populations no longer interbreed and become reproductively isolated. They can evolve into two separate species. So as time moves on, we have one population that splits into two separate populations. We get reproductive isolation at this point, and then we get isolated gene pools diverging into separate species. We can have behavioral isolation when two populations that are capable of interbreeding develop differences in courtship rituals or other behaviors. Thinking about courtship rituals in terms of birds especially. The next kind of isolation is called geographic isolation, when a population is separated by geographic barriers like rivers, mountains, or bodies of water. So there were two populations of squirrels in the Grand Canyon, and a small population of the Albert squirrel became isolated on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and that forms two separate gene pools, and now we have a subspecies called the kaibab squirrel. So they both live in similar regions. Here we have the Albert squirrel population area, and then here in this little light purple area, the kaibab squirrel. The next kind of isolation is called temporal isolation, when two or more species reproduce at different times. So, for example, there might be 3 species of orchids that live in the same rainforest. Each species has flowers that last only one day and must be pollinated on that day to produce seeds. If they bloom on different days, they cannot pollinate each other, so they are isolated from each other. We also have crickets. We have the spring field cricket and the fall field cricket, and they reproduce one in the spring and one in the fall. They are different species. In chapter 16, we talk about the grants and their investigations in the Galapagos Islands, and they showed that natural selection takes place very frequently and sometimes rapidly. And they also show that the variation within a species increases the likelihood that it can adapt and survive environmental change. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos finches descended from a common ancestor. He proposed that natural selection shaped the beaks of different bird populations as they became adapted to eat different foods. So we have different kinds of finches. We have the tree finches. We have the vegetarian finch, getting the bark off the plants, and its beak is designed to grip and hold tightly like a pair of pliers. Then we have another finch that feeds on small exposed insects on plant surfaces. It has thin, straight, narrow beak like a needle-nosed pliers. Then we have two species of ground finches. We have one that feeds on insects, fruits, and nectar. It has a curved beak to probe and grasp at the tip. And then we have another ground finch that feeds on large, thick seeds, and its beak is thick, strong, and sharp, like wire cutters. Peter and Rosemary Grant from Princeton University realized that Darwin's hypothesis rested on two possible assumptions. For beak size and shape to be evolved, there must be enough heritable variation in those traits to provide raw material for natural selection. So there must be a variety of beak sizes, and there must be then the differences in beak size and shape must produce differences in fitness. So we must have more some beak sizes make you more readily able to reproduce. So we have all of these different kinds of finches here, seeing in the Galapagos finches, and many of the characteristics appeared as a bell-shaped distribution typical of polygenic traits. So shows there are great variation of traits in these Galapagos finches. The data from the Grant couple showed the individual finches with different sized beaks had different chances of surviving drought. When food was scarce, the individuals with largest beaks were more likely to survive. They observed that the average beak size in that finch population increased over time. So percentage surviving, so we have 0% surviving if you had a 6, 7, 8 millimeter long beak. But if you had a 12 or 13 millimeter long beak, you had 50 or 60% chance survival. This is a documentation of directional selection that we talked about in the last section. Shows that competition and climate change can drive natural selection. Shows that variation within a species increases the likelihood that the species can adapt and survive some sort of environmental change. The current hypothesis about Galapagos finch speciation showed that speciation in Galapagos finches occurred by a founding of a new population, then geographic isolation, changes in the gene pool, behavioral isolation, and competition. So many years ago, a few finches are from South America here, species M, we'll call them, arrived on the Galapagos Islands. We call this the founder effect in previous sections. The allele frequency of the founding finch population could be different from those in the average from the population, because a few finches actually moved. Over time, populations on each island adapted to local environments. So over many generations, natural selection could cause two distinct populations to evolve. Population A on this island and population B on this island. And each one would have a phenotype that is then adapted to that environment. Birds that are most different from each other have the highest fitness. The more specialized birds have less competition for food. So over time, we wind up with species that evolve and change, and that increases the differences between them. So we get new species A, B, C, D, and E, all on different islands, all more well adapted to each individual environment.